Empires rarely die in battle. Most collapse the same quiet way a star burns out, not with an explosion, but with a slow, invisible exhaustion from within. And the Soviet Union was no exception. Its greatest enemy wasn't an army. It wasn't America. It was arithmetic, the one force no ideology can escape. For much of the 20th century, the USSR stood like a giant across half the world. It rose from revolution, survived famine, crushed Nazi Germany, sent satellites into space, and forged an empire held together by steel, discipline, and belief. From the outside, it looked unbreakable. A superpower, a civilization built on sacrifice and collective strength. A nation that promised to outgrow capitalism, outbuild the West, and reshape human destiny. But beneath the victories and parades, another story unfolded. A quieter, more fragile story that almost no one could see. A story written not in the language of ideology, but in the cold mathematics of economics. The Soviet dream was built on a bold idea: that human willpower could replace the market, that planners could replace prices, that quotas could replace incentives, and that an entire economy could function without the basic signals that guide every transaction, every decision, every act of production. In the early years, it seemed to work. Massive factories rose out of nothing. Fields were collectivized. Steel, coal, oil. Production skyrocketed. The country industrialized at a pace the world had never seen. But success hid the cracks. When a system runs on quotas instead of outcomes, strange things begin to happen. Factories weren't rewarded for usefulness, only for hitting targets. So they produced nails too large to use, shoes that didn't fit, machinery too heavy to move. Quantity over quality, output over purpose, appearance over reality. And slowly, the economy began to lose its meaning. Without prices, planners had no way to know what people truly needed. Without profit, factories had no reason to innovate. Without ownership, no one cared about efficiency. And without incentives, creativity faded into silence. The Soviet Union didn't suffer from corruption. It suffered from blindness. The system had shut off the very signals that make an economy alive. Across the country, shortages began to spread. Bread, meat, soap, shoes. Everyday goods vanished, not because the USSR lacked resources, but because the distribution system was collapsing under its own weight. People stood in lines not for luxury, but for survival. A queue became a symbol, not of collective pride, but of systemic failure. Behind the facade of strength, the Soviet state relied on something it rarely admitted: debt. Silent money printing, oil exports to mask inefficiency, and the belief that ideology could override economic reality. But reality does not negotiate. By the 1970s and 80s, productivity had stalled. Factories were outdated. Technology lagged behind the West. The military consumed enormous resources. And energy prices, the lifeline of the Soviet budget, began to fall. At the same time, the state printed more rubles to keep the illusion alive. Rubles that bought less each year. Rubles that no one trusted outside Soviet borders. Rubles that reflected an economy drifting toward collapse. In the end, the Soviet Union wasn't defeated by capitalism, espionage, or foreign pressure. It was defeated by its own internal contradictions. The simple laws of supply and demand, the reality of human incentives, and the universal truth that no empire can survive when its economic foundation crumbles. And here is where the past whispers its warning. When governments suppress price signals, when production is disconnected from purpose, when debt replaces productivity, when political promises replace market realities, the outcome is predictable. Today, around the world, powerful nations rely on money printing, controlled prices, subsidies, and short-term political decisions to hold their economies together. Energy becomes leverage. Budgets grow heavier. Debt becomes permanent. And the cracks begin to resemble the same patterns that once shaped the Soviet collapse. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. The fall of the USSR is not just a Soviet story. It is a human story, a lesson about systems that try to command what cannot be commanded. Innovation, incentives, value, and trust. In the end, the Soviet Union collapsed quietly. Not with a war, not with an invasion, but with a whisper from the heart of its own economy. A whisper that said, "The numbers no longer add up." Empires rise with belief, but they fall when belief can no longer hide the truth. Money is more than currency. It is information. It is trust. And when a system destroys that trust, it destroys itself. If you care about money, power, and the lessons history leaves behind, subscribe to Face of Money, where we explore how empires rise, how they fall, and why the patterns never truly disappear.